The star streams burned cold. The morning Sael's cannons fell silent over the Voran 4th Fleet, or what had been the Voran 4th Fleet before her guns had turned into an expanding reef of slag and frozen atmosphere drifting outward in the dark between systems. She stood at the forward observation lens of the unconquered Meridian, her flagship, her 4 arms folded in 2 pairs across her chest, her 6 eyes open fully, all 6, which she permitted herself only in private moments or in the immediate aftermath of battle, when the blood-heated command still sang through her, and the need for full situational awareness hadn't yet released its grip on her nervous system. The lens was 3 meters across and perfectly transparent, and it showed her, without softening or filter, the wreckage of what she had done. It was enormous. The 4th Fleet had numbered 1,140 warships when the engagement began 16 hours ago. She had brought 2,300, but the numbers alone didn't account for the scale of what she was looking at. The Voran had fought with particular ferocity of a people who knew what was at stake, who understood, in the blood logic of 8 centuries of war, that if Sael's forces broke through here, the path to Vorth itself lay open. They had fought like that understanding was a fuel that burned hotter than anything their reactors could generate. They had thrown themselves at her lines in coordinated assault waves so precisely timed and so brutally executed that in the first 4 hours she had lost nearly 300 ships and had begun, for exactly 1 period of 40 minutes, to consider the possibility that she might not win this engagement. That period had ended when she had authorized the use of the phase annihilators. The phase annihilators were not weapons that the Kaelthari Empire deployed lightly. They were not weapons that could be deployed lightly. Each one represented the entire industrial output of a mid-tier colony world for 3 years, and their effect on local space-time was such that the regions they operated in remained navigationally compromised for decades afterward. The Emperor had authorized 6 of them for this campaign. She had brought all 6 and had not expected to use any of them, because she had not expected to need them. She had used 3 phase annihilators, triggered in sequence along the Voran fleet's central formation, had effectively erased 400 ships in the span of 11 seconds, and had introduced into surviving Voran command structure a degree of psychological shock from which they had never recovered. The remaining 740 Voran ships had fought on. She gave them that they had fought on, and they had died fighting on, and none of them had run. Not one. And she had noted this in her battle log not as sentimentality, but because she had spent 90 years fighting the Voran, and she knew them well enough to know that their willingness to die rather than retreat was not stubbornness or fanaticism, but something older, something that she had long ago stopped trying to name. And she had destroyed them all. The last Voran vessel had gone silent 3 hours ago. Now she stood at the observation lens and looked at what remained and ran the numbers in her secondary mind. She was Kaelthari, and like all Kaelthari of sufficient rank and age, she maintained 2 parallel cognitive processes, one for immediate perception and one for strategic analysis. And the numbers were, by any measure that had been applicable to this war for 800 years, extraordinary. Vorth was 11 light hours away. She had never been this close. No Kaelthari commander had ever been this close. The record, held by Grand Admiral Tessavain during the 3rd expansion campaign 4 centuries ago, was 22 light hours, and Tessavain had turned back from that position because her supply lines were overextended and her ships were damaged, and the Voran had 20 fleets between her and their homeworld. Sael had, after this engagement, 1,987 functional warships. She had supply vessels sufficient for 60 days of sustained operations. She had 3 phase annihilators remaining, and she had, as best as her intelligence could determine, nothing between her and Vorth except approximately 14 hours of travel time and the Voran home defense perimeter, which was formidable in normal circumstances, but which had been designed and built and staffed on the assumption that an enemy would never approach, and having already destroyed every significant fleet asset the Dominion possessed. The home defense perimeter had not been designed to stop 2,000 warships arriving with 3 phase annihilators. She had already received the Emperor's order. It had arrived 4 hours ago via hyperspace relay, encoded at the highest classification level, authenticated 3 times. The Emperor's voice had been calm in the recording. Emperor Vathus was always calm. It was one of the things that made him effective and slightly terrifying. And the order had been simple. General Sael, destroy Vorth. Do not occupy. Do not negotiate. Do not delay. The The Voran Dominion ends at Vorath. You have our complete authority and our complete confidence. Complete the work of 800 years. The Empire does not forget. The Empire does not forgive. The Empire endures. She had listened to it 3 times. She had, on the third listening, found herself focused on a phrase the work of 800 years, and she had thought about what that phrase contained. The weight of it, the specific compacted density of 8 centuries of war, of generations of Kaelthari, and Voran born into a conflict that was already ancient when their grandparents were young, fighting for reasons that had by now been simplified and distilled and refined through centuries of propaganda and necessity into something that felt like truth, but that she, privately, in the part of her mind she did not share with her subordinates or her superiors, suspected was not truth, but was instead the shape that truth had been carved into by the long work of the war itself. She did not share the suspicion. She had never shared it. It was not a useful suspicion, and she was a general, not a philosopher, and the Emperor had given her a clear order, and she had 48 hours before the Voran Outer System forces could reposition the Interceptor fleet, and everything she had learned in 90 years of war told her that the order was correct and the window was real and the chance would not come again. She authorized the advance toward Vorath. Then she went asleep because she had been awake for 31 hours and she was in need to be sharp. Commander Drevh had not slept. He had been awake for 40 hours and had no intention of sleeping and had in fact instructed his ship's medical officer to prepare a continuous stimulant compound that would allow him to remain functionally alert for another 90 hours if necessary, though he had private doubts about whether he would need more than 48. The Patience of Storms, his flagship, a heavy cruiser of the Dominion's 7th Response Squadron, was the only vessel of significant military capacity still in range of Vorath. Everything else was dead. Everything else was the expanding debris field that had been the 4th Fleet, which had been the last line of defense between the Kaelthari advance and the homeworld, and which had, under Admiral Gorvash's command, fought with comprehensiveness and a commitment that Drevh found himself unable to think about for more than a few seconds at a time, because when he did, something happened in his chest cavity that was not compatible with functional command. Gorvash had been his teacher. Gorvash had been the one who had, 60 years ago, when Drevh was a junior navigator on a patrol frigate on the marginal reach, pulled him out of a tactical exercise and said, with characteristic bluntness, "You think 3 moves ahead when everyone else thinks 1, which means you either end up commanding a fleet or dead in a stupid engagement you should have seen coming, and I would prefer for you to command a fleet." Gorvash had then spent the next 15 years making that happen, and now Gorvash was debris, and Drevh was a senior military officer of the Voran Dominion still in possession of a functional ship, which meant he was, in practical terms, the last military commander the Dominion had. He stood at the tactical display in the Patience of Storm's command center, his 2 primary manipulators folded against his thorax, his 4 secondary limbs moving across the display's input surface in the rapid, complex patterns that Voran command officers use for simultaneous data access, pulling up fleet dispositions, supply chain assessments, weapons inventories, the Kaelthari force composition as best as surviving sensor rays could estimate it, the projected arrival time of the outer system forces, the projected arrival time of the Kaelthari fleet at Vorath's orbital perimeter. The outer system forces would arrive in 56 hours. The Kaelthari fleet would arrive at Vorath's perimeter in 14. The gap was 42 hours. 42 hours during which the home world would be defended by the home defense perimeter and nothing else. The perimeter was good. The perimeter would kill a significant number of Kaelthari ships. But the perimeter was not built to stop this, and the perimeter's commander, Admiral Second Rank Vaetha, had already transmitted to Drevh a precise and devastatingly honest assessment of her capabilities, which could be summarized as, "We will make them pay for every kilometer, but we cannot stop 2,000 ships with phase annihilators from destroying us if that is what they have decided to do." Drevh had read the assessment twice and had then set it aside, because reading it more than twice would not change its contents, and he had other things to do. What he was doing was running every military option available to him through the tactical matrix and watching each one fail. A suicide run by the Patience of Storms against the Kaelthari flagship would accomplish nothing except the deaths of his crew and himself. A hyperspace relay message to the outer system forces ordering them to increase their approach speed beyond rated capacity might shave 8 hours off their arrival time, introduce catastrophic drive failures, and still leave them 34 hours late. any conventional weapons deployment from a single vessel against 2,000 warships was a mathematical absurdity. He had been running the Matrix for 20 hours. Every option failed. He had run options that his tactical officers had considered too desperate to suggest, options that other officers in his position might not have considered at all, options that required assumptions about physics and logistics and Kaelthari doctrine that were, he acknowledged, not well-founded. They all failed. The math was the math, and it was clear. He was about to run the Matrix for the 37th time when his communications officer, Subcommander Drevh, said, "Sir, signal from the surface. Priority absolute from the High Archivist." Drevh stopped. The High Archivist of Vorath was not a military figure. The High Archivist was the keeper of the Dominion's central records, not the political records, not the military records, but the deep historical archive, the oldest repository of information in Voran civilization, a physical structure built into the bedrock of Vorath's largest continent that had been continuously maintained and added to for over 3,000 years. The High Archivist communicated with military commanders approximately never. "Put it through," Drevh said. The signal was audio only, which was unusual, and the voice that came through was old, genuinely old, with a particular dry precision of someone who had spent centuries working with historical documents and had developed, through that work, a relationship with language that was exact and economical and slightly airless. "Commander Drevh, I am High Archivist Sothen. I would not contact you in your present circumstances if I did not believe the matter was of the highest consequence. I have opened the sealed section." Drevh went very still. Every Voran knew about the sealed section. It was part of the historical curriculum. A single paragraph, included without elaboration, noting that the deep archive contained a section sealed by imperial order 700 years ago, and that the sealing order had never been rescinded and the reason for the sealing had never been recorded. Children learned about it and wondered about it for approximately one lesson period, and then moved on to more pressing things. It was an artifact of bureaucratic history. A curious footnote, the kind of thing that excited archivists and interested almost no one else. "You opened the sealed section," Drevh said. "I did. I have held this position for 140 years, and I have thought about opening it for most of that time, and I have always declined because the sealing was a valid imperial order, and I am a custodian, not an authority, and it was not my decision to make." A pause. "The circumstances have changed. If the Kaelthari destroy Vorath in the next 2 days, the archive is destroyed with it, everything in it, including what is in the sealed section. Whatever the Emperor who sealed it was trying to protect or preserve or hide, it will cease to exist if I do nothing. So I opened it. What did you find?" Another pause. Longer. When Sothen spoke again, her voice had not changed in texture. It was still dry and precise, but there was something underneath it that Drevh could not immediately name, and then he named it. It was the voice of someone who had spent their life with history and had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about particular history was wrong. "Commander Drevh, I need you to come to the archive in person. What I found cannot be transmitted. The physical medium is too fragile and too important to risk in any digital rendering. And what it contains is, I will tell you this much over this channel, what it contains is the reason for the war, the actual reason, not the version we have been taught, the actual event that began it." Drevh stood very still for 3 seconds. "I'm on my way," he said. Sael slept for 6 hours and woke feeling the particular clarity that came from sleeping well before decisive action. Her body felt settled. Her secondary mind had been running analysis while her primary mind rested, and when she came fully alert it briefed her on the updated fleet status, the revised arrival estimates, and the sensor readings from the forward pickets. Everything was as expected. The advance was proceeding. Vorath was 9 light hours away. She ate a protein compound that had no taste worth describing, but that provided optimal caloric and nutrient input for extended command operations, and reviewed the battle plan for the approach to the home defense perimeter. The plan was not complex, because complex plans against static defenses were generally inferior to overwhelming direct application of force, and she had the overwhelming force. The perimeter's guns were formidable but finite. Her phase annihilators could excise sections of the perimeter's line as needed. The passage would cost her ships She estimated between 150 and 250, depending on how the Voran deployed their reserve emplacements, and would take approximately 6 hours from first contact to complete penetration, after which she would be inside the perimeter, in Voritha's orbital space, with the planet below her. She had been in the profession for 90 years, and she had destroyed planets before. Not many. Planetary destruction was reserved for extreme cases, for worlds that could not be pacified, and that represented ongoing strategic threats, but enough that she knew the technical procedure, and had executed it, and had lived with having executed it. She knew what it looked like from orbit. She knew what the instruments registered. She knew the particular silence that fell over Command Center during the process, a silence that was not respectful or grieving, but was simply the silence of people whose training had not prepared them for the specific quality of what they were witnessing. She knew all of this, and she did not think about it more than was necessary for operational planning. What she was thinking about, instead, as she reviewed the battle plan, was a question that she had been carrying for a long time, and that had no practical operational relevance, and that she nevertheless could not quite put down. The question was, why did this begin? She knew the official history. Every Kaelthari knew the official history. 800 years ago, the Voran Dominion had committed an act of such profound violation against the Kaelthari people. The nature of the violation had been recorded and taught and repeated so many times that she had absorbed it the way she had absorbed everything about Kaelthari culture, as something that was simply true, a bedrock fact as basic as gravity or the speed of light. The violation had been real. The war had been just. 800 years of it. Just necessary. The long work of a civilization defending itself and its right to exist. She believed this. She had believed it her entire adult life. She had built her entire adult life on it. But there was a thing that happened sometimes, in the long spaces of a campaign, when the fighting was briefly suspended and the numbers were being counted, and there was nothing to do but think. There was a thing that happened where she would find herself looking at the specific shape of the war and noticing things about that shape that the official history did not quite account for. The way both sides had, at every point of potential peace in 8 centuries, found reasons to continue. The way every near peace had been destroyed by an incident, and every incident had been investigated and found to be the other side's fault. The way the war had achieved a kind of perpetual motion quality, feeding itself, sustaining itself, as if it had needs of its own that were separate from the needs of civilizations fighting it. She did not share these observations. They were not operationally relevant. She returned her attention to the battle plan. 9 light hours, 6 hours through the perimeter. Vorith, the Emperor's order was clear. The shuttle from the Patience of Storms broke atmosphere over Voritha's capital continent in a steep re-entry arc that was faster than safe and slower than Drevh wanted. He had left the ship in Sub-Commander Taven's capable management with orders to hold position and maintain all communications blackout, except emergency. He did not want the Kaelthari tracking his movements, and had taken a pilot and 2 of his personal security staff and made for the surface. He had 28 hours. The archive complex was built into the root of a mountain range, accessible through a series of tunnels that bored 3 kilometers into the rock. Drevh had been here once before, on a diplomatic occasion that had involved the public gallery and the exhibition spaces, and not the working stacks. He had not thought much about it at the time. He thought about it now as the transport carried him through tunnels lit by the archive's own power systems, independent, geothermal, designed to outlast civilization itself. And he thought that whoever had designed this place had been thinking in very long-time horizons, had been thinking about the possibility that everything above them might cease to exist, and the archive would remain patient in the rock, holding its information for whoever came next. High Archivist Sothen was waiting at the inner gate. She was old in a way that was purely physical. Voran, like all the long-lived species, did not necessarily show age in their cognitive presentation, and Sothen was as sharp as her voice had suggested, her 4 sensory stalks erect and fully extended, her manipulator hands clasped in the formal posture of a scholar greeting a visitor of significant rank. She was small. She looked like she had been compressed over a century and a half of archival work into something dense and precise, and completely without wasted space. "Commander," she said, "thank you for coming. You said it couldn't be transmitted." "Correct. This way." She led him through the working stacks, past row after row of physical storage media, crystal matrices, encoded lattice structures, some formats so old that only specialist equipment could read them. And Drevh noted the scale of the place, the sheer volume of accumulated information represented by the corridor after corridor of organized storage, and thought about the 800 years of the war represented in those stacks, and the centuries before the war, and how much of what was in those corridors constituted the Voran understanding of who they were, and where they had come from, and why they were. The sealed section was at the very back of the deepest level. The door was old, genuinely old, a construction style that Drevh estimated at 700 years, sealed with a lock system that Sothen had apparently spent 3 days defeating before contacting him. The door was open now, and the room beyond was small, and the environmental controls inside were set to a conservation standard that made the air cold and very dry, and that made Drevh's breathing feel slightly effortful. In the center of the room, on a preservation table with active atmospheric management, were 12 documents, physical documents, actual physical recording media, the kind that hadn't been in common use for 500 years. Their format was Voran's standard script of approximately 800 years ago, which Sothen had told him she could read directly. It was a simpler version of the modern script, not a foreign language, and which had been rendered into current standard text by her translation work over the 48 hours since she opened the room. Sothen handed him a data tablet. This is my working translation. The originals are in front of you if you want to confirm any passage directly. Drevh took the tablet. He looked at it for a moment, at the text on the screen, at the first line of the first document, which read, "This account is true and complete and is set down by me, Archivist Adept Vorvain, in the 43rd year of the reign of Emperor Daseth, for the purpose of creating a record that will survive even if all other records are destroyed. And I seal it here because if it were found, it would be used to destroy the Dominion from within before the Kaelthari can destroy it from without." He sat down on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, and he began to read. What the 12 documents contained, in summary, was this. The war had not begun the way either civilization had been taught it began. 800 years ago, the Kaelthari Empire and the Voran Dominion had been not enemies, but cautious neighbors. They had shared a border region, an area of space with no settled worlds, but with significant resource deposits, and they had been in the process of negotiating an agreement about the joint use of those resources. The negotiations had been proceeding, not quickly. They were complex, involving multiple subordinate agreements about access rights and extraction limits and conflict resolution mechanisms. But proceeding, then a colony ship had been destroyed. A Kaelthari colony ship, carrying 6,000 colonists, had been destroyed in the border region. The Kaelthari government had immediately declared the destruction an act of Voran aggression. The Voran government had denied any involvement. The Kaelthari government had published sensor recordings that appeared to show Voran weapon signatures. The Voran government had declared the recordings fabricated. The Kaelthari had mobilized. The Voran had counter-mobilized. And within 18 months of the colony ship's destruction, the war had begun. This was the official history. This was the agreed-upon record. The war had started because the Voran had destroyed a Kaelthari colony ship and then denied it, and the Kaelthari had gone to war to make them answer for it. What was in the sealed documents was the testimony of Archivist Adept Vorvain, who had been, 800 years ago, a junior archivist in the Dominion's Central Intelligence Coordination Office, and who had been present, not involved, present, in an adjacent office at an adjacent time, in a position to hear and see things that she had not been meant to hear and see, when the order was given. The order had not come from the Voran military. It had not come from the Voran Emperor. It had not come from any Voran authority. The order had come from a ship, not a Kaelthari ship, not a Voran ship, a ship of a configuration that none of the intelligence officers in the room had been able to identify, that did not match any known design in either the Kaelthari or Voran database, that had appeared in Voran space approximately 3 months before the colony ship destruction, and had made contact with the Voran intelligence service through a communications channel that Vorvain described in precise technical detail, a channel that operated on a frequency band that no known civilization used, that appeared to pass through normal space without actually occupying it, that was audible to equipment but not to unaided senses. The ship had offered the intelligence service 2 things. The first was a weapon capable of destroying the colony ship in a way that would mimic Voran weapon signatures in the sensor recordings. The second was a promise. If the colony ship was destroyed and the war began, the war would end with Voran victory within 50 years. Vorvain did not know who had ultimately accepted the offer. She had been listening through a wall. She had heard voices she did not recognize. She had heard the offer made, and she had heard, after a long silence, an acceptance. She had then gone immediately to her superior and reported what she had heard, and her superior had disappeared within 24 hours, and Vorvain had understood, with the survival instinct of someone who had been in intelligence work long enough, that she needed to become very quiet and very invisible very quickly. She had. She had spent 40 years as a middle-rank archivist in a regional office and had been apparently forgotten and had eventually been transferred, at the end of her career, to the Central Archive on Vorith, where she had spent her final years writing these 12 documents in a room she rented under a false identification and depositing them, in the final weeks before her death, in the sealed section she had created through a technical manipulation of the archive's own cataloging system, Sealed, under the authority of Emperor Daseth, whose imperial authentication code she had, in her 40 years of careful archival work, obtained through methods that she described only as requiring significant patience. The promised Voran victory within 50 years had never materialized. The war had continued. The ship with the unrecognizable configuration had never been seen again, as far as Vorvain could determine. The war had been running on its own momentum for 800 years. It had been started deliberately, by an entity that was not Kaelthari, not Voran, something else. Drevh read the 12 documents through. Then he read them again. His mind, which was very good at keeping multiple analytical tracks running simultaneously, and had been doing this for 40 years of military command, was running about 6 right now, and they were all arriving at the same place, which was, if this is true, then none of it was real. None of the 800 years of justified war. None of the accumulated reasons. None of the enemies and the dead, and the planets turned to debris. All of it built on a fabrication. All of it built on a single act of deliberate false flag manipulation by a third party for reasons that Vorvain did not know, and that Drevh, sitting on the floor of the cold seal room with a data tablet in his hands, also did not know. How confident are you in the authenticity? He said. I have spent 2 days on nothing else, Sothen said. The physical medium is genuine. The materials are consistent with 800-year-old manufacturing processes in ways that cannot be fabricated without technologies we do not possess. The handwriting is consistent with known samples of Vorvain's official documents. The authentication codes she used for the sealing are real. I verified them against a historical record. The technical specifications she gives to the communication channel are, I had our communications archive check them. They describe a real phenomenon that our science has documented precisely once, in an anomalous sensor reading from a Border Patrol vessel approximately 400 years ago that was listed as an unexplained atmospheric artifact and filed away. She paused. Commander, I believe it is genuine. Drevh stood up. His legs were stiff from sitting on the cold floor, and he noted this distantly. He had, according to the chronometer on the data tablet, 20 hours and 11 minutes. I need to get this to the Kaelthari General, he said. Sothen looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. I thought that was what you would say. The problem with getting it to the Kaelthari General was that getting anything to Kaelthari General required, first, reaching her, which required passing to the current operational zone of 2,000 warships that had standing orders to destroy any Voran military vessel they encountered, and second, convincing her to not immediately destroy him upon contact, and third, convincing her that what he was transmitting was genuine and not a last desperate act piece of psychological warfare, designed to introduce doubt at a critical moment. He had, on the transport back to the Patience of Storms, identified 2 possible methods. The first was a direct hyperspace relay message to the Kaelthari flagship, routed through the neutral relay stations in the marginal reach. This would take approximately 4 hours for the signal to arrive, and would be immediately flagged by every Kaelthari signal's intelligence system as a priority intercept, and the content of the message would almost certainly be reviewed by intelligence analysts before it reached the General, and those analysts would almost certainly assess it as disinformation and filter it. And if by some chance it did reach the General would have no reason to trust a document delivered this way. The second was to take the patience of storms through the Kaelthari fleet line in the direct path between his current position and the Kaelthari flagship, and attempt to reach the flagship personally before being destroyed, which he estimated at approximately a 4% probability of success. He was considering these options when Taven said from the communication station, "Sir, we have an unidentified signal. It's not on any registered frequency." Drevh turned. "Describe it." "It's—" Taven paused, and Drevh heard in that pause a specific quality of confusion that appeared in experienced officers when their instruments were telling them something that didn't fit any category they had. "It passes through normal space without appearing to occupy it, sir. I'm reading it on the instruments, but if you were standing next to the antenna array, you would hear nothing. The frequency is not in our database." The temperature in the command center seemed to drop by several degrees, though Drevh knew this was probably his nervous system, rather than the environmental controls. "Can you identify the source?" he said. "Yes, sir. It's originating from approximately." Another pause. "Sir, it's originating from a point in space between our position and the Kaelthari fleet. There is no object at that position, according to our sensors. The signal is coming from empty space." Drevh stood very still. "Put it on speakers," he said. The sound that came through was not exactly a sound. It was more like a texture, like something that was using the medium of sound to convey information that sound was not quite adequate for, and it had a quality that Drevh could not describe and would not have tried to describe in any report, a quality that was something like patience and something like age and something like the feeling of looking at a very old structure and understanding that it will still be standing long after you are gone. And then, in clear Voran, not accented, not mechanical, not translated, in clean colloquial Voran that a native speaker might have produced, it said, "Commander Drevh, you found the archive. We had calculated a probability of 63% that you would. We are gratified. Sael received the anomalous signal at hour 31 of the 48-hour window, when her fleet was approximately 4 light hours from the Voran home defense perimeter, and she was in the final stages of reviewing the engagement plan. It came on a frequency that her communications officer had no classification for, on a channel that the instruments confirmed was present, but that appeared to exist in a manner that her signal analysis team found technically inexplicable, and that they described in their initial report as inconsistent with known physics of signal propagation. It was not encrypted. It did not need to be, because it was not using any transmission medium that her communications officers had ever been briefed on. It spoke to her in Kaelthari, perfect, unaccented Kaelthari, the kind produced by a native speaker, not a translation algorithm. And it said, "General Sael, you are close to completing a task that you have worked toward for 90 years, and that your civilization has worked toward for 800. We want you to know that we have watched your work with considerable interest, and that what you are about to do is what we've been waiting for you to do, and that when it is done, we will be very pleased." She was on her feet within 2 seconds of the first word. Her secondary mind was doing rapid analysis, cross-referencing signal characteristics, searching for any known communication system in the Kaelthari database that this could be. Her primary mind was focused on the voice and the words and the specific phrase, "what we have been waiting for you to do." "Source," she said, "between us and the Voran perimeter, General. Our sensors show nothing there. No object. The signal is coming from empty space. Full sensor sweep. All frequencies. All detection methods. Everything. Running now." She stood and waited. The signal had stopped after the opening statement. It had not continued. It was simply present, like a connection that had been opened and was waiting for a response. She did not respond. The full sensor sweep took 4 minutes. When the results came back, her senior science officer, a small precise entity named Vethis, who had served on her flagship for 20 years, and who had the particular quality of being completely unflappable even when the flapping was, by objective measure, appropriate, came to her and said, "General, the sweep has found something." "Show me." The tactical display updated. At the point in space from which the signal had originated, the sweep had found nothing. No mass. No energy signature. No radiation consistent with any drive technology, any life support system, any structural material. Nothing that any of her detection systems could detect. But There was a gravitational distortion. Very slight. Consistent, Vedis said, with an object of approximately 4 kilometers in length, but an object that had a gravitational signature and nothing else. No thermal output, no electromagnetic signature, no reflection of ambient starlight, no ion trail, no anything. An object that was there in the sense that gravity said something was there, and every other instrument said there was not. How long has it been there? She said. Vethus's manipulator hands moved across the display, pulling up the sensor archive. The gravitational distortion has been present in our record since. A pause. Since the beginning of the campaign, General. It has been with us for 8 months. Moving with us. Maintaining the same relative position. We did not detect it because the distortion is below the automated alert threshold, and no one was running manual checks for gravitational anomalies in what should be empty space. 8 months. It's been following us for 8 months, she said. Yes, General. She looked at the point in the display where the object wasn't and thought about 8 months and thought about the opening statement of the signal and thought about waiting for you to do and felt, for the first time in 90 years of military command, something that was not fear exactly but was the closest thing to fear that she permitted herself to experience, which was a feeling of being in a situation whose parameters she did not understand. She opened a communications channel. Who are you? She said. It answered them both simultaneously. Drevh heard the same answer that Sael heard. They were hearing different versions, one in Voran, one in Kaelthari. But the content was identical, and when Drevh would later compare notes with Sael, they would find that not just the content but the specific choices of phrasing, the particular words used for each untranslatable concept, were the optimal choices in each language. It was not translating. It had composed 2 versions of the same statement in 2 languages and delivered them simultaneously, and the versions were equally precise. What it said was, "We have many names in your respective historical records, though neither civilization has yet connected the name in one record to the name in the other, because you have not been sharing records. In the Voran tradition you appear, briefly, as the Outer Weavers, in a cosmological framework developed approximately 2,000 years ago and subsequently deprecated in favor of frameworks that had no room for us. In the Kaelthari tradition, you appear as the deep listeners in a series of pre-imperial philosophical texts that are now considered primarily historical curiosities. These names are both partially accurate. We do not have a name for ourselves that translates satisfactorily into either of your languages, because the concept we use to describe ourselves is not primarily a linguistic concept. We are old. We have been in this region of the galaxy for approximately 40 million of your years. We have watched many civilizations emerge, develop, and either grow into something interesting or destroy themselves. We find civilizations that destroy themselves to be, in the abstract, disappointing, though we do not intervene. We do not intervene. We have not intervened in your 800-year conflict. A pause. We did not start it either. We want that to be clear. We know that you have found, or will find, the archive documents. We know what those documents say. What they say is true. It was not us, the entity that approached the Voran Intelligence Service 800 years ago and offered the weapon that destroyed the colony ship. That entity is not us. That entity used a communication method that superficially resembles ours, which is one of the reasons we have chosen this moment to introduce ourselves. We do not want to be confused with what began your war. We are not what began your war. Another pause. What began your war is still here. Drevh felt the blood in his circulatory system make a sound that he could hear clearly, which was a sound it made when his body understood something that his mind was still catching up to. Still here, he said. In this system? In this region. It has been in this region since before your war began. It began your war with a specific purpose, which was not entertainment or malice or resource acquisition, though we understand why those might seem like plausible motivations. Its purpose was to observe what two civilizations do to each other over an extended period of total warfare. This region of the galaxy had 2 civilizations close enough for extended conflict, and it selected you for the study. A study, Drevh said. His voice was completely flat. He had gone past the register of emotion that expressed itself in tone, and into the register that expressed itself in a kind of blankness that his officers had learned, over decades, to find more concerning than shouting. A study, 800 years is, For an entity of its type, a relatively brief observational window. It was prepared to continue. However, there are two variables that it did not account for, which are: the first is that one of the studied civilizations found the archived evidence of manipulation, which introduces a possibility of course correction that the study design did not include. The second is us. It did not know we were here. We are, in its defense, very difficult to notice. Sael had been standing at the communications panel with an expression on her face that her bridge crew had not seen before and that they would later describe, in their separate accounts, in different ways. Some said she looked carved. Some said she looked very young. One said she looked like someone who had just discovered that the floor was not what they had believed the floor to be. "What do you want?" she said. "You said you have been waiting for this moment. What do you want from it?" "We want to see what happens. We have been watching for 8 months. Since we detected the study entity's device in the system, a monitoring array buried in the asteroid belt of your fourth target planet, which is how it has been observing both fleets. We detected it. We have been watching both the device and you. What we want, General, is the same thing we always want when we watch a civilization approach a decision point. We want to see the decision. We are not going to make it for you. We are not going to tell you what to do. We are going to tell you 2 things that you need to know in order to make a fully informed decision, because we find that decisions made with incomplete information are less interesting and less meaningful than decisions made with complete information. The first thing, the archive is real. What Commander Drevh has found is true. Your war was manufactured. The second thing, the study entity's monitoring array is also a weapon, a passive one, currently inactive. If Vorath is destroyed, it will activate. It will record the destruction and transmit the recording to wherever the study entity transmits its observations. This is normal for its study protocols. However, the activation of the monitoring weapon will also, as a side effect of its transmission mechanism, send a gravitational pulse through the star system at sufficient intensity to destroy everything within 4 light hours. Both fleets, Vorath, everything. The study entity did not design this as a kill switch. It is simply an artifact of the transmission technology. The entity is not aware that we know this. We discovered it 11 days ago. If you destroy Vorath, you also destroy your fleet, Commander Drevh's ship, and the monitoring array, and the study ends, and the entity loses 800 years of observational data, which it would find very frustrating. If you do not destroy Vorath, the study continues and the entity is content, and the weapon does not activate. Sael stared at the communications panel. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that if I follow my orders, I destroy my own fleet?" "Yes, along with Vorath and the Voran home system, and the study entity's 800 years of accumulated data, which, to be clear, is not our primary reason for informing you. We are informing you because you are about to make a decision, and you deserve to have the relevant information. Where's the monitoring array?" Vedis was already pulling up the data. The coordinates came through simultaneously from the entity's transmission. Precise, exact, as if it had known the question was coming. The array was in the asteroid belt of the fourth planet of the Vorath system, a large irregular asteroid that Kaelthari sensor sweeps had cataloged and dismissed as geologically uninteresting. "Can we destroy it before it activates?" Sael said, "Without triggering the transmission?" "We do not know. We are very good at observation, and very poor at weapons physics. It is also possible that any attack on the array will be interpreted by its systems as an attempt at interference, and will trigger the transmission defensively. We cannot tell you the probability. We can tell you that we have observed the study entity's technology for 8 months, and we believe its systems are sophisticated, and that a careful attack might succeed, and an imprecise one almost certainly will not." Drevh was already moving. He had listened to the same transmission and arrived at the same place, or almost the same place, from the opposite direction, and he was in the command center of the Patience of Storms with his tactical officer pulling up the asteroid belt data, and his weapons officer running targeting solutions, and his mind doing the thing it did, running 3 moves ahead. The array could not be attacked conventionally. The entity had said any imprecise attack might trigger the defensive transmission. That meant conventional weapons were out. Too imprecise, too broad in their effect radius, too likely to hit the array with enough force and vibration to trigger the system before the actual destructive force arrived. What you needed was something that would eliminate the array's ability to transmit before it could transmit, faster than the speed at which its defensive systems could respond. He had one thing on his ship that could do that. He had one phase disruptor, not an annihilator, which was a different system, but a disruptor, which was a Voran-specific weapon that operated on the principle of targeted quantum decoherence, collapsing the organized quantum states of the target system and reducing it to thermodynamic equilibrium instantaneously at the speed of light, with an effect radius that could be calibrated to within approximately 2 meters at the distances involved. A phase disruptor hit was, in effect, the quantum mechanical equivalent of very precisely ceasing to exist. No explosion, no vibration, no shockwave that might rattle neighboring systems. Simply, organized matter, then not organized matter. The problem was a phase disruptor had an effective range of approximately 3 light seconds. The array was in the asteroid belt of the 4th planet of the Vorath system. Vorath was a 3-star system. The 4th planet was on the far side of the system from his current position. He would need to be inside the perimeter to get in range. He would need to get inside the Kaelthari fleet line to get inside the perimeter. He opened a hailing frequency to the Kaelthari flagship, not the anomalous channel, the standard military hailing frequency, the one that every ship in both fleets monitored as a matter of operational protocol. "General Sael," he said, "this is Commander Drevh of the Voran Dominion, aboard the heavy cruiser Patience of Storms. I have information you need. I am coming to you under provisional truce. I am transmitting my ship's identifier beacon, and I am requesting that you order your picket vessels to hold fire. I have 6 hours. If you want Vorath destroyed, let your ships shoot me down. If you want to know whether the last 800 years were real, let me through. You already heard the voice. You know why I'm calling." He cut the transmission and looked at Tevin, who was looking at him with an expression that was, Drevh thought, probably the same expression he had been wearing when Sothen had told him about the archive. "Navigation," he said. "Plot a course through the Kaelthari line toward the flagship. Maximum approach speed." "Sir," said his navigation officer, "if they shoot." "If they shoot, we die." "Yes, but I've run the other options and they all fail." He settled into the command seat. "They won't shoot." He was approximately 60% confident in this. 60% was, in his experience, quite good. "Course plotted, sir." "Execute." Sael heard Drevh's transmission. At the same moment, she was issuing orders to her picket line. The timing was not coincidental. The entity had clearly been coordinating, though it had denied manipulation. She noted this but put aside. She had been thinking very quickly. Since the entity's transmission about the weapon in the asteroid belt, and about the order she had received from the Emperor, and about 48 hours, and about the wait of 800 years, and about what work meant when the work itself had been a lie constructed by something that wasn't Kaelthari or Voran. She had also been thinking about the phrase we find that decisions made with incomplete information are less interesting and less meaningful, and she had found herself with the specific irritation of a commander being observed, annoyed at being an object of interest to something that old and that patient. She did not want to be interesting. She wanted to be right. She had issued orders to her picket line to hold fire on any vessel matching the patience of Storm's transmitted identifier. Now she sat and waited and thought. The Kaelthari Empire had not sent her here to think. The Kaelthari Empire had sent her here to execute an order that was, on the face of it, clear and historically justified and strategically sound. She had the force. She had the window. The Emperor's order was unambiguous. The Emperor's order was also, if the archive was genuine and the entity was telling the truth, based on a lie that was 800 years old. She was a general, not a philosopher. But she was also someone who had spent 90 years fighting and killing and watching others die for a cause she had always believed was real, and the question of whether that cause was real was not, it turned out, something she could set aside in the interest of operational efficiency. It was too large. It occupied too much space. It sat in the center of every other calculation, and would not be moved by any mental effort she applied to it. She opened a channel to the entity. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" she said. "You just told us you've been watching us for 8 months without revealing yourself. You've been following my fleet. You tell us there's an enemy we can't see and a weapon we can't confirm. And the only way to verify either is to either destroy Vorath and see if we die, or not destroy Vorath and take your word for it. You have a significant interest in Vorath not being destroyed, because the entity you described has a monitoring array there, and if it loses 800 years of data, it will presumably move on, and you'll lose whatever you're watching us for. We are, in other words, potentially being manipulated by a second source in order to prevent us from completing the disruption of a first source's manipulation, and the net effect is the same. Vorath survives. War continues. Someone continues to observe. A pause. Long enough that Sael found herself wondering if she had closed the channel by mistake. Then, yes, that is a coherent and well-constructed analysis. You are correct that our incentives might align with a deceptive narrative in the way you describe. We cannot prove the negative. We cannot show you the absence of manipulation in a way that distinguishes itself from sophisticated manipulation. We can show you the array. We can give you the coordinates, which we have already done. You can look at it. You can determine for yourself whether it is what we say it is. That is the only verification we can offer. And the archive? Commander Drevh has it. When he arrives, you can examine it. We cannot authenticate it for you. Only your own scholars can do that. And you have approximately 14 hours before the Voran perimeter engagement would need to begin, and you have no scholars with you who specialize in 800-year-old Voran physical documents. You will have to make a judgment, based on incomplete information. Yes, as all decisions ultimately are. We did tell you that decisions made with incomplete information are less interesting. We did not say they were less correct. Sometimes the incomplete information is sufficient. Sometimes the judgment works correctly despite the gaps. We have watched many civilizations make decisions at moments like this one, and we have noticed that the quality of the decision is not purely a function of the information available. It is also a function of the character of whoever is deciding. Sael sat with this for a moment. That is, she said, either genuinely wise or the most sophisticated piece of flattery I have ever encountered. We have been called both. The patience of storms came through the Kaelthari line at hour 34 of the 48-hour window. It was, by any measure, a remarkable thing. A single Voran heavy cruiser, 200 officers and crew, moving at maximum approach speed through a corridor of 2,000 Kaelthari warships, every one of which had its weapon systems active and targeted, and was holding fire by the specific order of the general who had just won the most significant Kaelthari military victory in 800 years. The picket vessels on the line's edge tracked the patience of storms with targeting solutions running and weapon locks maintained. Standard protocol, and their captains had their hands very close to their fire authorization controls and were waiting for the general to change her mind, which generals were known to do. And they were also doing something that military personnel in both fleets had been doing for 800 years, which was looking at the enemy and feeling the specific cocktail of responses that 8 centuries of war had bred into both civilizations. Drevh felt it from his side. He could see the Kaelthari ships through the observation ports as the patience of storms passed through, and they were massive, magnificent, brutal in design, built for 800 years of war, and he had spent his entire career destroying things that looked exactly like these. And he felt what he always felt when he looked at Kaelthari ships at close range, recognition, and the terrible intimacy of people who have been trying to kill each other for so long that they have shaped each other, have developed weapons and tactics in response to each other's weapons and tactics, have grown into their opposition the way 2 plants in a small space grow into each other over time. He felt it, and he continued toward the flagship, and he did not let it stop him. The flagship was enormous. The Unconquered Meridian was a Kaelthari dreadnought of the newest class, 12 kilometers of weapons and armor and propulsion, and the specific concentrated lethality of 800 years of warship engineering, and it sat in space like a fact. Like something that was simply unavoidably true. Drevh requested a docking approach. Received clearance. Docked. He came off the ship alone, which was partly tactical calculation and partly something else. A statement, maybe, or a recognition that if he was to do this, he was going to do it without the buffer of escort, without the performance of protection that implied the need for protection, just himself and what he was carrying. General Sael was waiting in the docking bay. She was in person, exactly what Drevh's intelligence briefings had always described. For arms, 6 eyes currently at full open, all 6, which a Kaelthari would only do in circumstances of maximum attention, tall for her species, with a particular physical presence of someone who had been in command long enough that their body had organized itself around a habit of it. She was 90 years old and looked, as many Kaelthari did in late middle age, like something that had been worn to its essential components. They looked at each other across the docking bay. Drevh had thought about what to say and had decided to say nothing elaborate. He held out the data tablet with Sothen's translation. "Read this," he said. She took it without a word and read. He watched her read. He watched the expressions that moved across her face while she was reading. She was not, he thought, someone who showed much, but the content was not the kind of thing that left the face completely still, and there were moments as she went to the 12 documents where something passed across her features that was not a strategic calculation or a command decision, but was something more basic, something that belonged to the register of a living being encountering information that changes, the shape of everything that came before it. She read for 30 minutes. Drevh stood in the docking bay and waited. When she finished, she looked up. "You know this might be fabricated," she said, not aggressively, as a statement of fact. As a statement a rigorous mind makes automatically when encountering information that is too convenient. Yes, it's too convenient. Exactly the kind of thing a desperate enemy would produce to introduce doubt in a commanding officer at a critical moment. Yes, the entity is also too convenient. Unknown species, unknown motivation, tells us exactly what we need to hear at exactly the right moment. Yes, and the weapon in the asteroid belt might not be there, or might be there, but might not work the way it described, or might be designed to trigger if we attack it, which means testing it is itself dangerous. Yes. Sael looked at him for a long moment. All 6 eyes. "You ran the numbers before you came here," she said. "I always run the numbers." "What did the numbers say?" "That I couldn't stop you conventionally. That every military option available to me resulted in Voratha's destruction and the death of my crew, that the only non-zero probability path was this one." He paused. "The numbers also said, and this is not a number I should probably share with you, but I am sharing it because I think you're the kind of commander who wants all the information. The numbers said that if what's in that archive is true, then there is no legitimate military justification for continuation of this war. The casus belli was fabricated. Everything that's been justified by it is built on a false foundation. That is not an argument that changes the military situation. It is not an argument that changes your orders, but it is an argument that changes what your orders mean." Sael was quiet for a moment. "How do we find the study entity?" she said. "The entity told me it had located the monitoring array. I assume it has a position on the study entity itself." "I'm going to ask it," Sael said. She turned to a communications panel on the bay wall. Her flagship had communications capability in every compartment, which was standard for ships of its class, and she opened the anomalous channel, which Drevh noted she had clearly maintained access to since the initial contact. "You said the entity that started our war is still here. Where is it?" The voice came through both channels simultaneously again. Both of them heard it. "Approximately 9 light hours from your current position, at the coordinates we are now transmitting. It has been observing the aftermath of the battle. It detected our communication with both of you. It knows that you know about the array. It is currently deciding what to do about this development. You have, we estimate, approximately 4 hours before it reaches a decision. What are the possible decisions?" Drevh said, "It can activate the array manually, which triggers a gravitational pulse and destroys the system, ending the study but preserving the observations already recorded. Or it can deactivate the array and withdraw, writing off the study as compromised. Or it can contact you directly. It has not, in its history of study across many civilizations, ever chosen to contact a studied species. The other 2 options are more consistent with its established methodology. And if it activates the array manually, we can't stop it," Sael said. "Not from your current position. If you had a vessel in range of the array with a weapon capable of destroying it before the activation signal arrives, you might have a narrow window. The signal from its current position to the array travels at the speed of light. 9 light hours is 9 hours. If you can get a vessel to the array within 8 hours, you might be able to destroy the array before the activation signal arrives." Sael and Drevh looked at each other. "I have 3 phase annihilators," Sael said. "I have a phase disruptor, Drevh said. Better calibration, less collateral. My fastest vessels are survey scouts. They can make 4 light hours in under 3 hours at emergency drive. Not fast enough. No. Sael turned to the communications panel. What is your fastest vessel? A pause that was fractionally longer than the previous pauses had been. We can reach the array. We do not have weapons. We can interfere with the array systems directly, but only if we are in physical contact with it, which requires approximately 6 hours of transit at our operational speed. If the entity chooses to activate manually in less than 6 hours, we cannot prevent it. So we need to slow the entity's decision, Drevh said. Give it something else to look at, Sael said. They looked at each other again. Contact, Drevh said. You said it's never contacted a studied species. That makes it a variable it hasn't planned for. If we hail it directly, it has to decide whether to respond. That buys time. Possibly enough time. Sael stood in the docking bay of her flagship, 12 kilometers of the most powerful warship in Kaelthari history around her, 90 years of war behind her, and thought about the specific calculation of what it meant to hail something that had manufactured 800 years of mutual destruction as a study. And she thought that she had very few good options, and this was arguably the least bad one, and she opened a channel on the standard broadcast frequencies, all of them every registered. Communications band that either civilization used, and she said, Unknown entity. My name is General Sael of the Kaelthari Empire. Commander Drevh of the Voran Dominion is with me. We know what you did. We know why you did it. We know about the array. We are talking to you now because we want you to understand something, and we are asking you to listen before you make a decision that takes away our ability to choose. She paused. We have fought each other for 800 years because you put us in motion. We have killed billions. We have destroyed hundreds of worlds. We have done all of this believing we were fighting for something real, and you watched it, and you recorded it, and whatever you learned from it, whatever data you gathered from the deaths of people who did not know they were subjects. We are not asking for an apology. We are asking you to consider that what you are about to do, whether you destroy the system or simply withdraw, will determine what we do next. And what we do next, whatever it is, will not look like what you have been observing for the last 800 years. We will know what we are. We will know what was done to us. And we would rather you hear that from us than discover it later in whatever you observe next. Silence. Then a sound came through the speakers that was not the entity they'd been speaking with. It had a different quality, a different texture, colder, more precise, less like age and patience and more like machinery that happened to produce language. And it said, in Kaelthari, in Voran, simultaneously, General Sael, Commander Drevh, you are the first studied civilization in our experience to directly address us during an active observation period. This is statistically extraordinary. We are processing the implications. The entity that called itself, in the rough translation that the other entity provided, the assessors, because the root concept was closer to assessment than any other word either language had for information gathering, was, as best as Drevh and Sael could understand from the next 3 hours of communication, not a single organism, but a distributed intelligence that had been conducting civilization studies across the galaxy for approximately 200 million years. It was, in scale and age, so far beyond anything that either the Kaelthari or the Voran had ever encountered that the comparison was essentially meaningless. The 800-year war was, to the assessors, a moderately interesting medium-length study that had been proceeding well until a contamination event. This was what it called the moment Drevh found the archive, introduced variables that compromised the observational purity. The assessors did not think in categories like right or wrong. They did not have, as far as Sael could determine, anything analogous ethics in the way either Kaelthari or Voran culture understood ethics. What they had was method, and the method was observation, and the method's integrity was, for them, the closest thing to a moral category they possessed. What they had not anticipated was the other entity, the one that had been there before them, that called itself, in its own transmission, simply the witness, and that was, it turned out, another assessor, or had been. It was a rogue observational unit that had gone significantly outside the accepted methodology of the Assessors Collective in approximately the period corresponding to 800 years ago in Galactic Standard Time. The Assessors had known it was missing. They had not known where it was. They had not been watching this region. This was, the assessors communicated in a way that managed to convey something like collective embarrassment across the vast improbability of its scale and oversight. The rogue witness had manufactured the war. It had done this not because it was malicious in any way that the assessors could categorize, but because it had concluded, during a previous study, that civilizations under external pressure developed more rapidly and more interestingly than civilizations developing in isolation, and had decided to test this hypothesis by creating conditions for an extended conflict. It had modified its methods without authorization. This was a significant violation of the assessor's observational protocols. The gravitational pulse weapon in the monitoring array was something it had developed independently, also without authorization, as a way of ensuring that the study data was preserved even if the studied civilizations developed the capacity to disrupt the observation. The assessors, upon learning all of this, made a decision. The decision was communicated to Drevh and Sael simultaneously and was, in both languages, the same. We are going to disable the array ourselves. Then we are going to collect the rogue witness. We will do this within the next 2 hours. You will need to verify after the fact that the array has been disabled. As we understand, you cannot simply take our word for it, and we respect this caution. We also want to communicate the following. We have reviewed the archive documents. We have reviewed the communications records of both of your civilizations. We would say sorry, but this is not a concept we operate within. So instead we will say, we understand that what was done to you was not within the acceptable parameters of any observation protocol, including ours, and that the cost of what was done to you was not abstract. The data the rogue witness collected is data that was extracted from death. We do not have a framework within which to evaluate this adequately. We are going to try to construct one. We will not be back. We recommend that you are. Then both entities, the observer that had been following Sael's fleet for 8 months, and the vast ancient collective of the assessors somewhere in the deep space beyond both civilizations' reach, went silent. They waited. Drevh sat in the docking bay of the Kaelthari flagship, which was surreal, and watched the sensor feeds on a display that Sael had arranged for him, and watched the coordinates of the monitoring array in the asteroid belt of the 4th planet of the Voran system, and waited. Sael sat across from him, and watched the same feeds, and waited. Her bridge crew watched from a respectful distance, and said nothing. Drevh's communications officer, Tavin, was on a channel from the Patience of Storms, and was also watching, and was also silent. At hour 39 of the 48-hour window, the gravitational signature at the array's location changed. It changed in a way that Vedas described, with scientific precision and with a visible effort to find adequate language, as a gravitational signature consistent with a 4-kilometer object undergoing rapid transition to a quantum state we do not have instruments sophisticated enough to fully characterize, followed by the gravitational signature consistent with empty space. The array was gone. The monitoring weapon was gone. Drevh and Sael looked at each other. Verified through independent means, Sael said, and her science team ran 17 different sensor protocols over the next 20 minutes and confirmed, through every method they had, that the asteroid that had housed the array was now an unremarkable piece of rock with no anomalous properties. At hour 41, Sael received a second message from the Emperor. This one was also encoded at maximum classification, authenticated 3 times, and the Emperor's voice was still calm, but there was something different in the calm this time. It was a calm of someone who had received information that Sael had transmitted via hyperspace relay over the previous 6 hours, information about the archive and the entity and the weapon, and who had processed it and arrived at position. The Emperor said, General Sael, we have reviewed everything you have transmitted. We are consulting our senior scholars and our historical records independently. We will not give you a modified order until the review is complete. You have 11 hours remaining in your operational window. Do not advance on Voran until you hear from us. She closed the message and looked at Drevh. My Emperor wants 12 hours, she said. You have 11 left in your window, after which the Voran outer system forces arrive. Yes. At which point the military situation changes and an advance on Voran becomes significantly more costly. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Your outer system forces. Can you reach them? Can you tell them to slow down? Drevh looked at her. If I order them to slow their approach, I am reducing the only military deterrent I have left. I know you could still destroy Vorith. If I slow the outer system forces, you have a longer window. I know that too. Another silence. I need an independent verification of the archive. Sael said, not your word and not the entity's word. I need a Kaelthari scholar to look at those documents. 12 hours is not enough time for your scholars to run a full authentication. I know, but a preliminary assessment by a qualified expert is different from my judgment or the entity statement. Do you have communications access to Vorith from here? I have my ship. Can your High Archivist transmit a summary of the authentication work she has already done? Drevh thought about this. She can transmit. Your scholars can review it. It won't be conclusive. No, but it changes the weight of evidence. Sael stood, her 4 arms unfolded, extended, and she stretched in the Kaelthari manner, a full-body extension that Drevh had seen Kaelthari do only in private contexts, never in front of an enemy. She seemed to realize this, and he saw something pass across her face that might have been the Kaelthari equivalent of a rueful acknowledgement. You slowed the outer system forces. You ordered your ships to let me through. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I have been fighting your civilization for 90 years. I know nothing about you except how to kill you effectively. The feeling is mutual. Does that seem? She stopped. I don't have a word for what it seems like. Neither do I, Drevh said, in either language. The Emperor's final message came at hour 46. Sothen had transmitted her authentication summary. 3 Kaelthari historians on relay from the nearest Kaelthari academic center had spent 5 hours reviewing it and had issued a preliminary assessment that used the precise academic language of caution and conditionality that Sael had been expecting, and that, underneath the caution and conditionality, said, the evidence is consistent with genuineness and inconsistent with known fabrication techniques. The Emperor had read it. The Emperor's message was short. General Sael, do not advance on Vorith. Return to Empire space with your fleet. We are opening communications with the Voran Dominion through the diplomatic channel. Whatever comes next, it comes next through words. You have done enough. She read it 3 times. She had received orders from Emperor Vathus for 41 years, and she had followed every one of them, and she had trusted his judgment even when she hadn't fully understood it, and she stood in the docking bay of her flagship and read this one 3 times and felt something that she did not have a name for, and it was not relief exactly, and it was not grief exactly, and it was not the particular feeling of a military victory, and it was not the particular feeling of a military defeat. It was something she had not felt before. She thought it might be the feeling of stopping. The outer system Voran forces arrived at hour 56, 8 hours after the window had officially closed, 12 hours after Sael had suspended the advance, and found, upon arrival, a Kaelthari fleet that was in the process of reforming for a return transit, and a single Voran heavy cruiser that had parked itself in a position relative to the Kaelthari flagship that should not have been physically possible given the previous 800 years of the war, and a message waiting for them from Commander Drevh that said, do not engage. Stand by. Things have changed. The outer system commander, a veteran named Admiral Drevh, who had fought the Kaelthari for 60 years and who had pushed her engines to their limits to get here and had arrived expecting to fight and die in a final defense, and had instead arrived to find a situation she had no category for, received Drevh's message and read it twice, and then said to her tactical officer, stand by. Things have changed. The formal communications between the Kaelthari Empire and the Voran Dominion began 3 days later, initiated from the Kaelthari side through the diplomatic channel that had been dormant for 700 years, not because the channel itself was damaged, but because no one in either civilization had seen any point in maintaining it actively, since the war had been the only communication that either side had considered relevant for 8 centuries. The first formal communication from the Emperor to the Voran Senate was, after the authentication and encryption and diplomatic protocol that formal communications required, 3 sentences long. It said, we have reviewed the evidence. We believe what the archive contains. We want to discuss what comes next. The Voran Senate's response took 4 days and was considerably longer and was, in the assessment of diplomatic historians who would later study it, a remarkable piece of political writing. careful and precise and honest in its own account of what the Dominion's internal review had found, which largely confirmed what Sothen's archive had indicated, and which included an acknowledgement that the decision to accept the rogue witnesses' offer had been made by people who had been dead for almost 8 centuries, and that the nature of accountability for actions taken by the long dead was something the Dominion was prepared to discuss honestly and at length. Neither side found the discussions easy. 800 years of war had not left either civilization with many diplomatic reflexes. The habits of conflict were deeply embedded. There were political factions on both sides that found the archive convenient, which was to say that there were those who decided it was fabricated because accepting it as genuine required them to accept that everything they had spent their lives believing was built on a false foundation, and this was not a thing that everyone could do, and it was not a thing that could be required of anyone, and the diplomatic discussions incorporated this reality with varying degrees of grace. But the guns stayed quiet. The ships stayed in their own space. The border region that had once been the site of the colony ship's destruction and had for 800 years been a battlefield was quiet for the first time since the war began. Sael returned to the Kaelthari capital 6 weeks after the battle and was received by the Emperor in a formal ceremony that was less triumphant than the original plan for the ceremony had anticipated, because the original plan had anticipated the celebration of a total victory, and what actually happened was something that took longer to name. The Emperor received her in the Chamber of Long Memory, which was the oldest room in the Imperial complex, and which was lined with the names of every Kaelthari killed in the war, not listed individually, because there were too many but counted in numbers that were updated after every major engagement, and the current count, as of the end of active hostilities, was 2.3 billion. 2.3 billion Kaelthari. The Voran count was higher, 3.1 billion. The Voran territories were more densely populated, 5.4 billion combined across 800 years, for a war that had been started by something that was not Kaelthari and not Voran, and that had spent the intervening time watching what it had caused or what the assessors had described as significant scientific interest. Sael stood in front of the count and looked at the numbers and felt the full weight of 90 years settle on her in a way that it had not settled before, because for 90 years she had carried the weight with the explanation that it had been justified. And now the explanation was not gone exactly, but changed, was more complicated than she had ever allowed it to be, and the complication changed the weight. She did not collapse under it. She was not the kind of person who collapsed, but she stood there for a long time. The Emperor came and stood beside her. He was also 4-armed and 6-eyed, and he was, unlike Sael, not a military person. He was a political and administrative intelligence of first order, which was what imperial succession selected for in the Kaelthari Empire, and he had the quality of someone who had spent his reign managing something intractable and had been doing it with extraordinary patience, and had now arrived at a moment that was different from any previous moment. "You made the right decision," he said. He was looking at the numbers too. "I didn't know that it was. I had incomplete information. Everyone has incomplete information. That's what I meant." She thought about this. The entity had said something similar, and the entity had been either genuinely wise or very sophisticated at flattery, and she had not resolved which. Maybe the Emperor was the same. Maybe wisdom and flattery overlapped more than she had previously considered. "What happens now," she said. "Diplomacy," he said, "which is slower than war and more complicated, and involves a great deal of sitting in rooms with people whose customs you find alien, and in this case, with people who have been trying to kill you for 800 years. He paused. "I'm going to send you." She turned and looked at him. "You and Commander Drevh already established something," the Emperor said. "Not trust, exactly, but something adjacent to trust. Something that functioned like trust long enough to prevent the destruction of a civilization. That is, in diplomatic terms, that is a foundation. We don't have many of those." She looked back at the numbers. 2.3 billion. "They have 3.1, she said. "I know. I looked." A pause. "Yes," she said. "Send me." The diplomatic mission began 4 months later. Sael arrived on Vorath aboard a small diplomatic vessel. Not a warship, which would have been provocative, but a purpose-built diplomatic cruiser that carried 12 staff members, 3 translators, a historian, 2 archivists, and a quantity of documents that included complete copies of the Kaelthari Historical Archive's records of the war's origins, authenticated and certified. offered to the Voran Dominion, as a gesture the kind that had no precedent in 800 years of their relationship. She was met at the orbital station by Commander Drevh, who was technically too senior for this kind of meet and greet, and who was there anyway? She noticed, none of his security personnel visible. She had left hers on the ship. They stood in the station's arrivals bay and looked at each other. "You look different," he said, "without the fleet behind you. You look different, too." She paused. "Smaller." He made the gesture that she had learned from her translator's briefings, was the Voran equivalent of a dry laugh. "Yes, just the one ship now. How is the patience of storms?" "In dry dock. She took some damage on the way through your line." He said it without accusation. "Reparable." "Good." She looked around the station, at the Voran personnel moving through the space, at the architecture, which was different from Kaelthari architecture in ways she had never considered before, because she had never been in a position to consider them, had always seen Voran environments through targeting displays rather than through her own 6 eyes at close range. "I need to ask you something." "Yes." "Are you all right?" "After everything that happened." He was quiet for a moment. She watched the quality of the quiet, the way it had a specific texture that she was learning to read. Though she was aware she was learning to read a species she had spent 90 years treating as entirely opaque. "No," he said. "Not completely. I don't think either of us is, or should be." He paused. "But I think the word all right is something you work toward, not something you are. I am working toward it." "So am I," she said. They walked through the station together toward the diplomatic transfer shuttle, which would take them down to the surface, which would take Sael for the first time in her life to the home world of the civilization she had spent 90 years fighting. And there was a moment as they walked, neither of them speaking, where she became aware of the particular quality of the silence between them. Not the silence of enemies, not the silence of an absence of things to say, but the silence of two. People who had an enormous amount to say and were beginning to understand how much time they were going to need to say it, and were, quietly, making the decision to begin. Vorth was below them, blue and green and brown and white, very like other inhabited worlds she had seen, and very unlike them, alive. She thought about the entity that had watched 800 years of war with patient scientific interest. She thought about the assessors, somewhere in the deep spaces of the galaxy, reforming their methodology with deliberate care. She thought about the rogue witness, who had made a decision in a short span of time and had set 8 centuries in motion, and who was now, wherever the assessors had taken it, presumably being assessed. She thought about the long patience of things that were very old and watching. She thought, we are not a study. We are not data. We are not what happens when you set conditions and watch. She thought, we decide. The shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere of Vorth, and the blue-white light of the system star came through the viewport and turned everything in the cabin the color of something beginning. And Commander Drevh looked out the viewport at the clouds below them and said, very quietly, as if saying it too loudly might break it, "First time I've come home in 8 months. First time I've been here," she said. "What do you think?" She looked out at Vorth below her, at the planet that she had in her hands, the complete authority and the complete confidence of the Emperor to destroy, that she had been 11 light hours from enclosing, that was alive now with the specific aliveness of a world that did not know it had been 48 hours from ceasing to exist. And she tried to find a word for what she thought, and could not find it in Kaelthari, and tried Voran, and the translator's briefings gave her nothing adequate. And so she said, in the specific inadequacy of any language she had available, "I think it's worth the difficulty." Drevh looked at her. She looked back. 6 eyes for sensory stalks. 2 beings from 2 civilizations that had been trying to kill each other for 800 years, descending to the clouds of a planet that was alive. "Yes," he said. "I think so, too." The formal peace agreement was signed 14 months later. It took that long because peace agreements that end 800-year wars are not simple documents, and because both civilizations had factions opposed to the agreement, and because the archive authentication process took 7 months of joint scholarly work before both sides accepted it as conclusive, and because the process of accounting for what had been done, not blame, which was a category that became very complicated when the primary agent of the war's initiation was an entity that had already been collected by the assessors and was no longer accessible, but accounting, acknowledgement, The specific work of saying this happened, and we were part of it, and we carry this. That process was slow and painful and necessary and took as long as it took. But it was signed. Sael was there. Drevh was there. The Emperor of the Kaelthari and the First Council of the Voran Senate were there, physically present on a neutral station in the border region. The first time that representatives of both governments had been in the same physical space in 800 years. The document was long and detailed, and addressed resources and territories and reparations and joint historical commissions and a mechanism for kind of conflict resolution that might, in future, prevent a border dispute from metastasizing into 8 centuries of mutual destruction, and it had taken 9 months of negotiation to produce and contained provisions that neither side was entirely happy with, which was, the veteran diplomatic staff told Sael, the sign of a well-constructed agreement. When the signing was complete, there was a silence in the room that lasted for approximately 30 seconds. No one had planned the silence. It simply happened. The pens, physical pens for physical signatures on physical documents, because the symbolism of physicality was something both civilizations had independently decided mattered for this, were set down and the moment arrived and the silence came with it, and everyone in the room let it be. Sael stood and felt the silence and thought about all the things it contained. 800 years. 5.4 billion dead. A war started by a third party for observational purposes that had never been achieved anyway, because the data had been compromised in the final hours by the very variables that had been designed to exclude: the decision of the studied, the choice of the species that was supposed to be passive subjects, the specific human, not human. She corrected herself, the specific living quality of beings who, when given complete information, or as close to complete information as the universe allows, will sometimes choose not to destroy each other. The assessors had communicated once more, briefly, through the original channel 6 months after the battle. The message had said simply, "We are continuing to observe from a significantly greater distance and with significantly revised protocols. We want you to know that we have found the event of the last several months to be. We continue to struggle with adequate language. We have found it to be something that updated our models significantly. We do not apologize, because we are still constructing the framework within which that concept will be applicable to us. But we are constructing it." She had read this and had thought that even something 200 million years old could apparently be surprised, and that this was either reassuring or deeply strange, and had decided it was probably both. After the signing, when the formal ceremonies were concluded and the diplomatic staff were beginning the work of the reception and the translation of the agreement into the 17 subordinate languages of both civilizations, Drevh came and stood next to her. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. She tried to find the honest answer rather than the diplomatic one. "Like something ended," she said, "and like something started. And I can't tell yet which one is bigger." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that's probably the correct feeling," he said, "given the circumstances." She looked around the room, at the representatives of 2 civilizations that had been built over 8 centuries into shapes defined by their opposition to each other, and she thought about what it meant to unmake that shape and what shape might come after, and whether the history of what had been done could be carried forward into what came next without crushing what came next under its weight. She did not know the answer. She suspected that not knowing was itself part of the answer, that the uncertainty was not a problem to be resolved, but condition to be lived in, and that living in it with clear eyes and honest accounting was the beginning of whatever came next. Outside the station's viewports, the star that both civilizations shared, not technically the same star, but close enough, in astronomical terms, close enough, burned with the same light it had burned with for billions of years, patient and indifferent and present, giving light to everything in its reach without asking whether the things illuminated were worth illuminating. They were all in its light. That seemed, to Sael, like enough to start with. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.